Welcome, everyone, to this meeting of the Hoover Economic Policy Working Group. It's a privilege to even orchestrate this amazing session. Lee Ohanian is a senior fellow at Hoover and a professor at UCLA who will be orchestrating this panel of Kevin Kiley, who's a member of the California Assembly, and Michael Shellenberger, an author and an expert in this topic. And the topic is California homelessness, new policies to address an intractable problem. We're anxious to hear what you'll have to say. Lee, go ahead.
John, thank you so much. Homelessness is one of the most important and complex issues facing us, and we're delighted to have two experts joining us today to help explain why homelessness continues to worsen and to provide fresh ideas to address this issue humanely and in a fiscally responsible way. I'm pleased to introduce our two panelists in alphabetical order. One of our experts is the Honorable Kevin Kiley, who joined the California State Assembly in 2016. In 2020, Kevin was named the National Legislator of the Year by the Association of Independent Workers. Kevin's experience, this is remarkable. His experience ranges from having served as an inner-city Los Angeles high school English teacher to also serving as our state's Deputy Attorney General. Kevin has authored new laws on freedom of speech, privacy, and criminal justice reform. He is one of a group of California state legislators who have created a package of new legislation called ACT. And Kevin will get into that in this conversation to address homelessness in the state. Kevin received his bachelor's degree from Harvard and his law degree from Yale. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, thank you.
Our other panelist is Michael Shellenberger, who is the best-selling author of San Francisco, Why Progressives Ruin Cities. It was published last year. It's a current bestseller. And Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All, which has been translated into 16 languages. Both are remarkably good books, and I recommend them to everyone very highly. Many governments, including of the United States, the UK, Japan, Taiwan, and Germany, have called on Michael to testify and advise them in the area of homelessness and the environment. Michael received his bachelor's degree from Earlham College. We'll begin with Michael. And Michael, as I read your books, I've noticed that you describe yourself as being drawn positively to progressive causes back in the day, but that your visions regarding progressivism have changed over time. And I suspect writing San Francisco played a role in that. Each panelist is going to take about 6 to 8 minutes to make some opening remarks. We'll then have a conversation between the three of us. So Michael, we're looking forward to hearing from you and how you changed your visions regarding progressivism.
Sure, thanks, Lee. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to offer my experience and some of my research findings. So yeah, as background, I worked for the George Soros Foundation and many of his grantees in the late 1990s. I advocated for criminal justice reform, harm reduction, drug decriminalization. I still believe that we need to make a distinction between serious psychopathic and sociopathic violent criminals who belong in prison and people who are just drug addicts or people who are mentally ill and require medical care. And I thought that's what we were going for in the late 1990s. And I got out of the work in the early 2000s to focus on the environment, but sort of checked back in when many people did in around 2017 when drug overdose deaths rose to 70,000 in the United States. They were 17,000 in the year 2000, so just a huge increase. And to put that number in perspective, drug overdose and poisoning deaths in the United States will reach 107,000 or more this year. That's 3 times more people than are killed in car accidents in the United States. It's almost 5 times more deaths from homicides. And it's a number, it's just a shocking amount of deaths. It's the #1 cause of accidental deaths for adults age 18 to 45. So I think it's important to pull apart what we mean by homelessness. There's the proverbial mother with 2 kids escaping an abusive husband who has no underlying drug addiction or mental illness problem. She might experience some temporary homelessness, but for the most part, we do a pretty good job of taking care of that person as a society, both in terms of government agencies and in private charities. She is not going to take her kids and go live in a homeless encampment. I've interviewed hundreds of people in homeless encampments over the last 3 years. I've never encountered anybody who was sober, drug-free, or without mental illness, not a single person. I went to Amsterdam in 2019 and I discovered there were no homeless encampments. There was very few homeless people. In fact, we only found one and we had to go look for him. And I was with a member of parliament at the time whose husband oversees drug policy in Netherlands. And I asked what it is that they're doing. And he said, you know, we had open drug scenes like you have in California, but we shut them down. And they had them in the 1980s, the early 90s. They were mostly focused on heroin in one neighborhood of Amsterdam. And on my return, I discovered that there's a significant body of research into what are called open drug scenes. We euphemistically call them homeless encampments, but it's an imprecise word, in part because it tricks your brain into thinking that we're dealing fundamentally with a housing problem. California, without doubt, has a housing shortage, but that's not the reason that people go live in homeless encampments. These are open air drug scenes. Open drug scenes are open air drug markets where late stage addicts live because they have either been kicked out of the homes of friends and family, they've stopped working, and they want to be close to the dealers. Follows the exact same pattern in Europe. Open drug scenes are basically the same everywhere in the world. There's some variety in terms of the drugs used. We have a significantly higher share of seriously mentally ill people in those open drug scenes. And the reasons that we have them is because we allow them. They don't allow open drug scenes in many other parts of the United States. Boston briefly had an open drug scene at Cass and Massachusetts Avenues. They shut it down. It periodically comes up again, but there's just a different set of social norms on the East Coast, including among very progressive people. Similarly, New York has built sufficient homeless shelters and requires people to stay in them. New York shelters 95% of its homeless population. By contrast, Los Angeles and most of the rest of California only shelters a third. There's been a natural experiment that we've been conducting over the last several years to see what the different impact of those policies are. The results are in. We now know that more homeless people are killed in Los Angeles than in New York, even though there are, at least on paper, 14,000 fewer homeless people in Los Angeles than New York. That statistic alone, in my view, should merit shutting down the open air drug scenes, requiring people to go into shelter, building emergency shelters as required. Nearly 100% of the women in the homeless encampments, or the so-called homeless encampments, the open drug scenes that I interview, have been sexually assaulted multiple times. I discover almost every time I go to Skid Row, I discover mentally ill people, many of whom are still in a hospital gown, wearing a hospital bracelet, who are in psychotic states. Last time I was in Skid Row, I discovered a 2-story wooden structure that was serving as a brothel to engage in human trafficking and allow for prostitution. So in my view, the mortality figures alone should suffice to shut down the homeless encampments across California. The deaths, by the way, are from people being hit by cars, because sleeping on the street, people get run over by cars, homicides, and drug overdoses. It's not to say that those things don't occur inside shelters, they just occur at a far lower rate, which is why LA has 3 times more than New York. The final piece of it, so we have a housing first policy, which is this ridiculous policy that suggests that we should just provide free housing to anybody who demands it. That's literally what the policy says. That's not what works. It's not what's worked anywhere in the world. What works is a shelter first policy. We do have a moral obligation, and the Supreme Court has upheld that we have a legal obligation to shelter all of our citizens with clean, basic, and safe shelter. Housing should be earned as a reward for abstinence or complying with your psychiatric diagnosis. And that treatment should come first too. So it's shelter first, treatment first, housing earned. The final piece of that, I would say, is that we need a statewide psychiatric and addiction care system. I'm calling CalPsych. This is not a problem that can be solved at the county level. The LA health system is overwhelmed. There's no way that Los Angeles or San Francisco can treat all of the sick people that are on their streets. We can solve this problem at a statewide level. California is rich in land. Land and labor costs are much lower in other parts of the state. A single statewide system would allow for people to be placed in the psychiatric hospitals, shelters, drug rehab facilities, and group homes in different parts of the state where those vacancies become available, and to be much more efficient with much less administrative. So I'll just close by saying my conservative friends worry that I'm talking about creating a new government program. In fact, I'm proposing that we reduce the number of government programs from 58 different county-based psychiatric and addiction care systems. We should reduce them to a single system, CalPsych. And with that, I'll stop, Lee. And that gives us, I think, an overview of what I see the problem as and what I think the solutions are.
Michael, thank you. Thank you so much. Kevin, before I open it up to your opening remarks, I thought I would read the concluding statement from a California state government commission panel that was tasked with writing a report about homelessness. And the conclusion is the following. There are between 100,000 to 250,000 homeless in California. Their problems are diverse. They have multiple needs. Programs abound, but their effectiveness is hampered by a lack of firm leadership, a lack of a clear policy direction, and a multitude of policies existing under too many roofs. That state commission report was written 33 years ago in 1989. This reminds me of the former great baseball player Yogi Berra of the New York Yankees. So Kevin, I'd like to ask you, is this deja vu all over again from your standpoint and where California stands in terms of its homelessness issues?
Well, certainly. I mean, the problem keeps getting worse and the policies haven't changed. I mean, the things that Michael just spoke about just really aren't part of the conversation at all. The problem has been, essentially ignored for some time. It finally became so bad in early 2020, polling was showing that this was the #1 issue for Californians. So Governor Newsom decided he needed to at least look like something was being done. So he devoted his entire State of the State speech that year. This was, I think it was February of 2020. So it was just before everything with COVID began, to the issue of homelessness. He even said in his speech that it was a disgrace. And yet we've seen no change at all in the way the situation is handled. The solution is always just let's provide more funding. I mean, that's literally what it is. You'll see a big press release. We're taking homelessness seriously. We're going to spend $1 billion more this year. We're going to spend $2 billion more this year. There have been $17 billion spent over the last 4 years. And that's always been the solution, even though California's own nonpartisan legislative analysts, which provides periodic assessments of policy proposals, said in 2020, when there was this new proposal for additional funding, that new funding is not going to make a difference and will quickly dissipate, was their terminology, because there is no clear strategy. And they've sounded that alarm time and again. Even that year, Governor Newsom's own mental health czar said that homelessness in California is not a money problem, it's a leadership problem. That's the governor's own top advisor. He said it's a problem of leadership at the state level. And yet, nevertheless, we've simply seen the only real policy innovation, if you will, is this Project Room Key, Project Home Key, which is just the basic failed housing first policy. But that's just been sort of the only policy or strategy that exists aside from let's just throw more money at the problem. As we've continued to throw more money at the problem, it's only gotten worse. Homelessness has gone up in California while it's gone down in other parts of the country. As Michael noted, the disparities are just completely stark when you look at what's happening here versus elsewhere. I think we have about half of the unsheltered homeless population in the United States right now. So in 2020, I actually proposed doing an audit of all state homelessness spending to see exactly where the money was going. There's what's called the Joint Legislative Audit Committee in our legislature, and any legislator can propose that an audit be done. All you need to do is get a majority of the 5 assembly members on the committee and get a majority of the 5 senators on the committee to vote in favor of it, and the audit is done. Well, I got all 5 senators to sign on. They voted for it. However, the governor's office applied pressure to the 5 assembly members, and so 2 of them voted for it, and 3 of them ended up abstaining. And so even though it was a vote of 5-0 on the Senate side, 2-0 to 0 on the, or so 3, I guess, on the Assembly side, the audit did not go forward. Additional spending was proposed that year and last year, and things have continued as they have. By the way, I have introduced that audit proposal again this year, and we're having a hard time even getting it set for the committee to hear it in their meeting coming up on June 27th. So clearly there is just a lack of political will to really tackle the problem in the ways that have been shown to make a difference. So a couple other sort of facets of that is if you look at one of the issues that is sort of distinctive to this part of the country is we do have the Boise decision, which Michael alluded to, which suggests that you are not allowed to, the law enforcement can't essentially tell the homeless to move along, can't break up the encampments unless there's a shelter bed that's at least available for them to go to, which is why actually having available shelter is so important, because it empowers law enforcement to then take those actions. But we've also made a number of changes to our criminal laws in California that have undoubtedly contributed to the problem, starting with Prop 47, Prop 57, realignment, and various other early release programs that have, on the one hand, sent people out onto the streets. In many cases, they don't have any place to go, but then on the other hand, have enabled this sort of open drug use and eviscerated some of the tools that we have for allowing people to overcome addiction. So Prop 47, for example, has sort of been the death knell for drug courts in large parts of California. Drug courts have had a pretty, at least some record of success in getting folks to be able to turn their lives around. But the key was that if you're able to charge someone with a felony for possession of at least a Class A drug, then that provides leverage for prosecutors to induce the person to sign up for a drug treatment program. But under Prop 47, those offenses can no longer be charged as felonies. So in practice, they really aren't charged at all. And so there is no leverage to get people into those programs, and people are not, and these addicts aren't given the help that they need. And then of course, with mental health being such a huge part of the problem as well, this is another area where the state has just lacked any strategy whatsoever for effectively using the mental health dollars, which are vast, that we have. California has the Mental Health Services Act. This passed 10, 12 years ago. It was this billionaire's tax that was proposed. Darrell Issa, who's now the mayor of Sacramento, was sort of the chief proponent of it. And there have been several audits and reports by the Little Hoover Commission, I guess unrelated to the Hoover Institute, I think, but going over the failure of these funds to be used effectively and to really get help to the folks that need it. It's one of those things where, again, money just seems to be vanishing into thin air. This is another thing that I've tried to work on. We had set up I had legislation that would have actually, required tracking where these dollars went, required, measuring which programs are being funded at the county level, measuring what the actual outcomes are, in terms of allowing people to get past some of these issues that are such a big contributor to homelessness. But the way our legislature works, that bill actually passed a committee, but then it sort of vanished behind closed doors in what's called the appropriation suspense file. So that's a few pieces of the problem. The overarching issue is that we just don't have. There's been no political will to actually take on the issue of homelessness in the very clear, eyed way that Michael just explained it, which is looking at what's actually happening on the ground and what policy mechanisms are available to try to give people help.
Kevin, thank you so much. So I come at this problem or this issue from an economics background, and it seems that the first order of business is really to identify and try to measure and quantify what we can. And what strikes me as just so surprising is that so much of what I've read about homelessness is that it seems the state has pretended for a long time that this was not a mental health issue, that mental health problems were not a significant component of that. So case in point, there was a state report that indicated 29% of those who were homeless had mental health and or substance abuse issues. Michael, you mentioned that you've gone to these homeless camps and you can't find anyone who is not in this category. And I think if we ask really anyone, that homelessness is not a normal state of affairs, chronic homelessness. And there's a UCLA study that found 88% of those were identified as having substance abuse or emotional health issues. The LA Times did a piece where then they identified 77% as having these issues. Thoughts on why we've tried to avoid confronting what seems to be 75 to 80% of the challenges that we face, and why we're so far behind the 8 ball now in terms of addressing this and trying to get these people treatment and help. What is it about that aspect that we've tried to hide from for so long?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is just that it's confusing because we do need more housing. I mean, we don't have enough housing in California. I think everybody agrees with that. I don't even need to say anything about it. The second thing is that we need more places for people to go. We shut down these encampments all the time and then people just go somewhere else. So you have to have shelters, psychiatric beds in hospitals, group homes like residential care facilities, some amount of permanent supportive housing, which is now the dogmatic single only alternative, but you do need some of that. And rehab centers. I mean, those are basically, you need those 5 different kinds of facilities, but that's not why people end up in the open drug scene. There was a deliberate strategy to mislead people by so-called homeless advocates starting in the 1980s. And this is not even my view. This is something I got from the academic literature, including from the very left-wing academics, Teresa Gowen, Christopher Jenks at Harvard. They wrote the best books on homelessness, and they describe how basically socialist or progressive or radical left activists in favor of giving more subsidized housing for poor people started to mix up the population of just poor, very poor people with the population of people suffering from addiction and mental illness. And, I'm sympathetic to some amount of subsidized housing. I support Section 8 vouchers, for example. I think Section 8 vouchers have done a lot of good. That's a way we subsidize housing for low-income people. I support the earned income tax credit, which basically subsidizes low-wage workers and rewards work. My concern is that you have people that are in late-stage addiction including people with serious mental illness like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, who need medical help. And instead, we just are trying to give them their own apartment units without treating the underlying cause of their so-called homelessness. Obviously, it doesn't work. You know, one of the things about addiction is a mental disorder that leads you to lose control of your behaviors. And so, you know, people that don't know much about addiction, I mean, really half of us have family or friends that have suffered from pretty serious forms of addiction, but the society does have some awareness that people that are suffering serious addiction require an intervention. We have a whole TV show called Intervention. But once you quit working, overstay your welcome with friends and family, you're kicked out of your friends or family house probably because you've been stealing, lying, and cheating them. You end up on the street, then it's up to society to provide that intervention. And what one should do is say, you can't sleep outside. You can go into shelter, you can go back home, you can move somewhere else, but you can't stay outside. As Assemblymember Kiley said, you know, we have this ruling now, which I think I'm glad to have. It just says you have to have basic clean shelter for people. So we have to provide that. We should. Why don't we do it? Well, you've got these so-called homeless advocates, all of whom are basically pretty radical, often anarchist groups. And I'm speaking specifically of the San Francisco Coalition on Homelessness, the various groups that exist in LA. These are folks whose radical politics lead them to become homeless advocates. And they literally are out there trying to prevent people from getting medical care, including like pregnant women. So what is that? That is what I would call, and again, I've liberally stolen from the best available scholarship. Very little is original to my own analysis. I synthesized. But the best I could come up with is it's pathological altruism on the one hand. It's some idea that I'm helping you. Because when you interview somebody on the street who's an addict, and you're like, hey, can we get you inside to get some help? They're like, no, I'm fine right here smoking methamphetamine and fentanyl. I don't want to move. I interviewed a woman who was 8 months pregnant who did not want to go inside. She was a fentanyl addict. Well, we have to grow up a bit and go, first of all, no, you can't do that because we have laws and sidewalks don't belong to you. They belong to everybody. And B, we're not going to allow people to just self-destruct on the streets like that. So on the one hand, it's pathological altruism, but then there's a darker, more radical kind of hatred of civilization, anti-system, anarchism that motivates the leadership. I think for the average person on the street, we're just, you know, being dumb liberals, I guess, or you could call it Big Lebowski syndrome, you know, which is kind of, if you're familiar with the great Coen brothers film of the name Big Lebowski, there's a California thing which is very much like, hey, take it easy, man. You know, you like to drink Chardonnay and smoke marijuana. Why not let this poor person sit there and smoke meth and fentanyl in a tent?
Michael, the skeptic in me is tempted to say, I'd like to ask you for your opinion about this. Is homelessness a growth industry in California? There are people who are making a living from this. They have some self-interest. And again, I'm not saying this is true, but the economist in me says, a lot of people have some skin in the game and are making money from what is a horrible human condition. Reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the money sustains it. These things they're not contradictions. In other words, you know, the conquistadores believed in God and they also wanted the gold. So the homeless policy advocates, they don't wake. I mean, the thing is, you have to remember about homeless policy advocates is that they're not, I mean, they're the CEOs of some of the providers, can make $250,000 a year, but the advocates, they're just like pretty low wage, nonprofit, true believers. And they certainly don't wake up in the morning being like, I hope there's more homelessness because it'll provide me with more jobs and money. On the other hand, yeah, in a more kind of emergent quality, the homeless industrial complex, I think, as a kind of emergent phenomenon, doesn't want to solve the problem. But I think at the individual level, you know, and even at the CEO level, I mean, there's a beautiful little book, I cited it briefly in San Francisco, by the CEO of Path, which is one of the big homeless service providers in Los Angeles and also in San Diego. And he wrote a book, very dark, being like how there's all these interests that don't want to solve homelessness. And he was like a service provider himself. So I think there's some of that. But I think that the ideology operates on the whole society, not just on the institutions, you know. And so in that sense, I think people are trapped in this pathological altruism.
Kevin, I'd like to bring you in. I'd like to return to ideas about accountability and accountability of what our policies are implementing or achieving. And you know, the facts that you both have touched on, you know, regarding mental health issues and homelessness and what we need to do about it. At some level, there's a common sense in your face. Hey, there's no surprise why we continue to fail. So, Kevin, from your point, if I might ask you, and feel free to say what you're willing to say, and if there's areas you'd like not to go into, that's, I understand. But having been in the legislature for 5 to 6 years, are you surprised that there has been more recognition of, hey, we need to confront this 800-pound gorilla in the room, and we need to do it with some accountability? Based on your experience with your colleagues, I read your Democratic colleague Phil Ting remark, we've spent billions on this, and it's unclear whether we've succeeded at all. Do you get a sense of a bipartisan connection of trying to advance this? And I'd love to hear some ideas from you, representing your colleagues, about the ACT package of legislation.
Yeah, so that's something that we've proposed in the Republican caucus, and you know, it touches upon many of the issues that we've been talking about in terms of making it easier to build shelters, in terms of providing real mental health treatment, reforming criminal laws, and having some measure of accountability. You know, to your question, like, is there maybe some bipartisan will to do something about it? I'd say not really. I mean, in the sense that you might have a few people who talk about it, but you don't see any real action, any major paradigm shift. And, you know, to your last question to Michael, I think that was an interesting question, because, you know, when it comes to sort of what is ailing California, I think it's often a combination of this sort of radical or woke ideology on the one hand, and corruption on the other hand. And I think that, you know, in most cases, the latter factor is actually more controlling. And sort of the radical ideology is just kind of like window dressing or what have you. I mean, or a smokescreen. Like if you look at our failing public school system, which is absolutely abysmal, widest achievement gaps pretty much in the country, pretty much the lowest outcomes for kids who are eligible for free or reduced lunch. That's a result of the completely corrupt education establishment that we have, completely run by teachers unions. They spend more on politics than anyone in California. But then we get things like mandatory CRT as a sort of a smokescreen for all of that, right? That is part of this sort of radical progressive ideology. So I think that when it comes to homelessness, it's probably a similar story in some sense. You have this vast homeless industrial complex, whatever you want to call it, that feeds off the system. But then there is this sort of, completely warped ideology that suggests that, well, we should just, somehow letting people die on the street and wither away is somehow like, the progressive thing to do, when that's a pretty, hollow understanding of freedom, if that's how we're going to conceive it. I would like to say that there are occasionally, a moment like the governor's 2020 State of the State, where there's this recognition that we need to at least look like we're doing something about it. But so far, there hasn't really been any major policy movement that would actually move us towards the sort of solutions that have been shown to work in other states. I mean, it's not brain surgery, right? You can cite many examples of places that do what I like the way that Michael framed it: shelter first, housing earned, and you provide the services like mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment, job training, family reunification, the things that have been shown on the basis of actual data to work.
So what seems to be missing from a lot of discussions about homelessness, but which are front and center in Europe, and Michael, Portugal is one country that that I've read a little bit about, that's really quite liberal about the use of drugs, but you simply cannot do it on the street. You cannot live on the street. I'd like to get both of your. Let me start with you. Part of the ACT package of legislation that you and your Republican colleagues have advanced, accountability, compassion, treatment. Part of that is a significant investment in state level psychiatric bed capacity, clinic capacity. Almost certainly more psychiatric specialists, ranging from probably, I'm guessing, MDs down to PAs and nurse practitioners. When we look at, and at some level, this brings up, the interesting complex issue of institutionalization. And I believe Gavin Newsom's CARES Act got through one committee. I believe it got through one committee. I believe it was yesterday, which would, well, Kevin, you're going to know more about it than I am, so I'll let you describe what this passage or going through this committee means for getting severely mentally health challenged people the treatment they need. And is this something that you could work with the governor on, in the sense that he seems to be at least be recognizing some aspect of this and advancing ideas that are broadly in line with what you and Mike were talking about?
Yeah, I mean, and I should say that is, I think, actually is one thing that has perhaps been, a positive proposal. It's not like necessarily, the one thing that's going to solve the whole problem. And there's, you referred to the additional funding that we're proposing to actually have trained mental health professionals available. So those are sort of two separate things. The CARES Act is looking at reforming conservatorship laws, providing a greater ability to sort of get people who are at risk to themselves or others off the streets and into treatment. And then the part of this ACT set of bills dealing with mental health would make sure that we have the capacity there to get them the help that they need. So that bill has passed the Senate. And it passed the Assembly Judiciary Committee yesterday. It's actually gotten a lot of pushback from the likes of the ACLU and some of these other social justice groups, the folks that Michael was referring to. But so far, it's gotten pretty broad bipartisan support.
Michael, let me bring you in. I looked at some numbers in terms of the number of mentally ill who were in state hospitals back in the day versus today. So in the 1950s, about 600,000 Americans in some form or another were in institutions. If you just scale that number up by population growth, that would be about 1.4 million today. We have fewer than, I believe, 10,000 nationwide institutionalized. So we've been deinstitutionalizing people for 75 years. A lot of people cite Reagan for this, but most of that deinstitutionalization was done by the time he became president. A lot of it was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Thorazine was developed around that time in the 50s as an antipsychotic drug. I'm not a psychiatrist, but my understanding is that treating severe schizophrenia and psychotic episodes is challenging. So as as someone who has been part of the progressive movement, how would you think about these issues with the ACLU and civil liberties when we're talking about people that really, at some level, can't tell the sky is blue anymore? I mean, I hate to put it in that dimension, but the interviews you've done with people certainly present that way. So thoughts on how we can get these people treatment when they're not really in a position to necessarily make that decision for themselves?
Yeah. I mean, if I had, like a perfect world, I think we would have more ways to get our loved ones the psychiatric care and to compel the psychiatric care that we think they need. I think a big part of the reason that we don't, and that we do it at such lower levels than other developed societies, is that we are so much more libertarian. And that libertarianism exists on the left and the right. And in fact, it's the overlapping libertarianism that contributed to the deinstitutionalization. Now, I should say, I think that some amount of deinstitutionalization was good. We had too many people in hospitals, but we went way, way too far. We went much further than Japan and Europe went. Japan had much less deinstitutionalization than Europe. Europe had much less than we did. We had the most. So you do need some amount of psychiatric hospitals. Group homes are a great alternative for people with schizophrenia. My aunt was in a group home. I mean, there's not a lot of disagreement among everybody other than the really radical deniers of mental illness, of whom the ACLU straddles that a bit. Sometimes they deny mental illness. Sometimes they deny that simply that you should coerce some amount of people to get some care. So I think that I think part of the reason I put some emphasis on a care system is I think that if you have a proper care system in place, it's going to be a lot easier to compel treatment or get people into treatment without the need for courts in general. I don't know how much, addicts, not very many, hardcore addicts. So some amount of compelling care is going to be required. I think Americans are going to have a really hard time compelling psychiatric care for people that don't break any laws. I think, some ways that's sad, because I don't think any of us, like if your brother or mother or sister or whatever, son has schizophrenia and became an addict and was living on the street, you'd really wish they could get care before living on the street. But it may be that for now, particularly given how many people are on the street, that the mechanism will be law enforcement, and, as Assemblymember Kiley mentioned, enforcing laws against open drug use, drug dealing, public camping. That enforcement of those laws, particularly given how many laws a single person breaks in a very short period of time, might be the best way to then compel treatment, in the sense that you offer the treatment, either rehab or psychiatric care, some mix, as the alternative to incarceration. I have a lot of respect and admiration for the mental health advocates that I describe in the book, which includes Treatment Advocacy Center, NAMI, and others who would like to see more coercive hospitalization, for example. I worry that I just worry they're not going to get very much of it. I mean, I think in terms of Gavin's new care court proposal, you have to remember that we have something called assisted outpatient treatment already, which we call Laura's Law. New York calls it Kendra's Law. Why don't we implement it? We have conservatorship, and the bar is super high because conservatorship is so radical in the sense of just taking, it's Britney Spears. Really, that whole case did such a disservice because so many other people have benefited from conservatorship, and many of the people that need conservatorship are not famous celebrities. They're really down and out homeless people. But we've just not even implemented the assisted outpatient treatment. And this is where, with the book, I got to a place where I was like, is it that the judges are too left-wing and pathologically altruistic? Is it that we don't have the right laws? I mean, it's a little bit of everything. We don't quite have the right laws. We don't have the care system. The judges won't require people to do assisted outpatient treatment. They won't use Laura's Law. So I'm a little, it's like on the one hand, do I support care courts? Sure. On the other hand, I can't quite understand why you wouldn't do what the governor's advisor, who Assembly Member Kiley just referenced, who says it's a leadership problem, why you wouldn't do what he says, which is the statewide psychiatric and addiction care system. There's a fair number of people, even on the pretty radical left, like a number of academic, very, very progressive academics who I've been in touch with before and since the book came out, who were like, look, if you had a proper mental health care system, they'd be much more comfortable with some amount of coercion. If you don't have that system in place, they fear, and I think rightly so, that people are going to end up in jail or in really poor facilities.
Kevin, in terms of the legislation that you and your colleagues have put forward, accountability, compassion, treatment, what types of investments are you thinking about? If you could wave a magic legislative wand to allocate funding to the creation of psychiatric treatment, psychiatric capacity within the state that seems to be sorely lacking. What type of investments are we looking at? And I'll just note that the California state budget now is up to $300 billion. I was shocked that that's a 50% increase over our budget just two years ago, and a budget that has risen about 3 times faster than per capita economic growth, inflation adjusted. The dollars seem to be there. What do you think we need to do, and how successful we'll be in terms of making those investments? Let me begin with Kevin. I'll come back to Michael.
Sure. So one, facet of it was a budget proposal to create what was called a mental health infrastructure fund. It would enhance and extend the state's temporary funding program to purchase, construct, or rehabilitate properties into new county mental health and addiction treatment facilities. Right now, there's a deficit of about 7,730 beds, and so the aim was to close that gap. And then secondly, to create new centers for behavioral health focused education in order to expand the treatment workforce to get the professionals that would be there to staff those beds. Those are investments that we have, as you say, plenty of money for. Not only this, $100 billion supposedly surplus that we're talking about, but all of the money that even is funded automatically as part of the Mental Health Services Act through this billionaires tax, which is a huge amount of money, at least a couple billion every year that could be used for that sort of thing.
You mentioned bipartisan support for Newsom CARES Act. As you look out, 1, 2, 3, 4 years out, if we don't change gears, we're not gonna advance the ball on this issue. As you chat with your colleagues within the Assembly, Republican and Democrat, I know there's not all that many Republicans in the Assembly. Are you encouraged at all by the discussions you have, or the visions of what others within the state legislature have? Do you see things changing much?
Probably not. I mean, without a change in leadership, I think that, we've seen these problems continue to grow in California, not just homelessness, but so many other things. And they've only gotten worse and worse. And you wonder kind of what the tipping point is. I will say that, there's perhaps an opportunity right now for a new direction in the legislature, because there's a just huge change in personnel going on, which is essentially being, is a product of 2 factors. One is that we just did redistricting, which has created whole new districts. Some people are running for other offices and so forth. And then the second thing is that we have people terming out for the first time in a long time in 2024. So in 2010, it was California voters changed the term limit rules. So you used to be able to serve 6 years in the Assembly, 8 years in the Senate. Starting in 2012, you could serve an overall 12 years, whether it's in one house or the other, or some combination of the two. So what that means is that the 2012 class, the first class to come in under those new rules, they're terming out in 2024. And so you have a bunch of legislators who will be ending their time in the legislature then, and then a lot are sort of leaving for other opportunities, knowing that that's on the horizon. So you've had this, and then there's also the Speaker of the Assembly is himself turned out in 2024. So there's been some efforts to oust him recently, which may ultimately happen within a pretty short amount of time here. So there is perhaps an opportunity for those who really care about these issues to try to encourage the dramatically changed legislature to take a new approach to things.
And let me ask you, as a lawyer, as a legal scholar, I did mention during introduction that in addition to all you do as an assembly member, you also are an adjunct professor of law at I believe McGeorge Law School. May I ask you if you've given thought to legal challenges over someone more I don't want to use the word coercive, but if there are people with mental health issues that are refusing treatment, have you given thought to the type of legal challenges that might be present there, and whether these types of new laws might stand up to court challenge?
I'm not an expert in that area. I think that, again, we have sort of, we have this Boise decision in California, or the Ninth Circuit, which is somewhat different than other federal circuits. So I haven't given a great deal of thought to that, though. For example, how this, some of the, what's currently in the CARES Act, it's still, by the way, a work in progress, this CARES Act bill. So we'll see what the final version looks like, but how that might, what challenges that might be susceptible to. I mean, I'm sure that, there are enough of these groups out there that sort of, their sort of reason for being is to file challenges along these lines as so-called homeless advocates that you probably will see, something or another, but I haven't analyzed it closely.
Okay. Michael, let me bring you in. You recently ran for governor for within the state. So I'd love to hear your ideas about, your feelings, your views about partisan issues within the state, political impediments to kind of getting the things done that you think, and that many of us think need to be done.
Yeah. Well, I agree with Assemblymember Kiley, obviously. I mean, I think that you need a political, this is going to have to be dealt with at the ballot box or not dealt with at all. I don't see, I mean, I hope, as Assemblymember Kiley said, that kind of some turnover in the legislature brings some change. If we can muddle through this and solve it by muddling, I'm all in favor of it. I mean, anything, whatever it would take to get some change. I tend to think it's going to require a political solution. I mean, yeah, what can I say? I mean, look, they got rid of, Chesa Bodine, the district attorney in San Francisco. I think there's a good shot they'll be able to get rid of the district attorney of Los Angeles. I think there's a good shot that Rick Caruso will be elected mayor of Los Angeles. Now, there's some very, very progressive radical left folks that are running who are police abolitionists that are in Los Angeles. So I don't know. I mean, there is this thing called the Curley effect, which you may know about. It's something that since I come from the left, I learn all these things that only conservatives know about. But I was informed there's this thing called a Curley effect, which is where, I guess he was the mayor of Boston, and he did a terrible job in the early part of the 20th century, and a lot of people left, but the people that stayed were the people that benefited from his policies. And so you can kind of get a downward vicious cycle. So, I mean, that's scary. To some extent, that's what's happening, right? Because the people that tend to leave California, even if you just look at the most high profile people, Joe Rogan and, Ben Shapiro and Elon Musk, they tend to be more kind of politically conservative or right of center. They which tends to be folks that want more social order. They have higher value on propriety, on stricter social norms. So as those folks go, you have an electorate that is more liberal and more Big Lebowskian. So, but who knows? It's so hard, predicting the future. It's just, we got to try to make the future because we can't predict it.
Sure. California shrinking. 6 million people moved out of the state between 2010 and between the 2010 and 2020 censuses.
Right.
Many of those would be somewhat self-selected into more, I would say, less progressive types of politics. Nevertheless, the surveys that are done in the state, to the extent we can talk about a median voter, those persons' priorities and what they are looking for still seem to be, very far away from the kind of policies we see implemented, for example, in San Francisco. As a guy who's working for political office, do you see an electorate that's really wedded to the status quo ideas that are stopping us from doing this? I often think, hey, only a small subset of the state can have these views that just seem to be coming from a whole different reality. So you've run for political office. Are you encouraged by what you see in terms of Californians? And if so, do you have any ideas about why their voices, why the middle's voice is not heard more within the state, at least in terms of the kind of policies that we're seeing?
Are you asking that to me, Lee?
Yeah, and then I'll bring Kevin in.
Yeah. Well, Kevin won, so it's probably. Yeah, it's a mixed bag, right? So, on the one hand, we had a lot of support from folks across the state. I think we get like about 5% in Los Angeles. We really didn't have money to advertise at all, so we were very happy to come in third. And we did find a lot of support from, Democrats, Republicans, independents. I think one of the biggest problems is actually the lack of, I just think it's not just an electoral problem, it's also a political machine problem. The Democratic Party and the Democratic machine and the establishment is so well organized and so powerful and has so much more resources than the conservative side of things. Now, to some extent, that's reflective of the voter registration because it's 24% Republican in California. I think it's 45% Democrat at this point, and what would that make it? 31% no party preference. But I also think it's reflective on the political machines. There's just a much higher level of organization and belief and confidence on the liberal side. I think there's this other dynamic, particularly among the elites, but the elites defined to include, the upper middle class, is that they tend to be, they're anywhere people now. There's this distinction, somewhere people, anywhere people. Somewhere people have to be in a particular place to do their jobs. Teachers, service workers, manual laborers, construction, janitors, whatever, plumbers. And then there's anywhere people, high-tech entrepreneurs, all sorts of other kind of knowledge industries. And these folks can do their jobs anywhere. And that includes often the people that can finance campaigns. So I just found there was weak commitment to California among affluent people capable of donating to political campaigns. There was I found some support and some belief in California, and there's certainly people like me that are just, it would take a lot for me to leave the state because I love it so much. I just really am a Californian and I am passionate about California. I'm still in love with the state. But I think there's a lot of other people that just kind of go, look, I can be in Miami, I can be in Austin, I can be, somewhere else and pay much less in taxes and have a really high quality of life and not have to deal with the chaos of homelessness. And I think that's a problem because, you know, if you think about the Carnegies and Rockefellers and Mellons, these early industrialists, as the new capitalists, bourgeoisie, so to speak, they would create a new political order. They would finance the new politicians. They would replace the tired old ancien regime. And if our guys, and if we end up self-segregating and self-sorting into red and blue enclaves around the country, I worry not only about California, but I worry about the whole country.
Kevin, let me bring you in, and I'd like to ask you just to segue about the process of construction and building. Is we can't really have a discussion about homelessness without talking about building more homes. I find it maddening how expensive it is to build in this state, how much red tape there is. I read just yesterday that the average cost of constructing a 500 square foot apartment, it may not even be that much, in San Francisco is $1.22 million. That would buy at the median home price in the country of $400,000, you could go out and buy 3 full-size family homes with land. You know, I'd like to ask you your thoughts about, why isn't there anyone within state or local government saying, hey, we have to stop this insanity. It shouldn't cost $1.2 million to build a cookie cutter apartment for the homeless. We're better off writing them checks for a few $100,000 and tell them to go find a housing elsewhere. And de facto, that's what's happening here. Do you see, is there any sense within the state legislature of, say, modifying the California Environmental Quality Act, which is one driver behind these of the top costs, or is there any progress that might be made in terms of, the Byzantine types of financing that are endemic in these types of affordable housing projects?
There's been very little. The two things that the legislature has been willing to do in a very minor way in recent years is sort of one-off CEQA exemptions for things like arenas or this Berkeley housing situation that recently came up, as well as reforming the zoning laws to some extent to allow for the greater flexibility in building accessory dwelling units or in subdividing one's own property. Those have really been the only two things there's been any interest in doing. Meanwhile, when it comes to homelessness in particular, there was an audit of homelessness spending in the city of Los Angeles. I believe it was $800,000 to house a single homeless person. The median home price in California, I mean, it could reach like $1 million next year, right? It's just absolutely insane. And so, the factors that are clearly driving this are to some extent the cost of materials and so forth, but then there's just the fees that result in tens of thousands of dollars at least of costs before you even break ground. Of course, the labor costs, when you have project labor agreements, skilled and trained workforce requirements, all of these things that the unions force the legislature to do. And if you don't, by the way, there's been some Democrats, they'll try to do a bill that doesn't have the full extent of prevailing wage, and the unions just absolutely go after them in really like vile ways sometimes. And then, CEQA is, Jerry Brown said that reforming CEQA was the Lord's work. He did nothing about it in his 8 years as governor, his last 8 years as governor. So, all of those are issues that contribute to the undersupply of housing in California in general, but are of course relevant to the homeless situation as well. And by the way, Gavin Newsom promised a Marshall Plan for housing when he came to office, and new permitting has actually declined. And we're several $100,000 short of the units per year that he promised. I will say, by the way, just as one sort of more general comment, piggybacking on your last question, sort of my lack of optimism that I, have expressed in response to your questions on this issue and other issues. That's a lack of optimism in sort of the capacity of our legislature as it's now constituted to right the ship of its own accord. I do think that it's a pretty exciting time for those who are interested in seeing political change in California, because there's a lot of sort of forces exogenous to the Capitol that are influencing our politics, which Michael mentioned several of them. What we've seen, the recall of the school board members in San Francisco, the recall of the DA in San Francisco, both by overwhelming margins, what's going on in Los Angeles. And so there is this like growing sense, even in the most liberal cities in the state, that we don't need to just sort of accept what life has become in California, that we can do things differently. I think the legislature is sort of the hardest institution to change for various political reasons. But, when you have a sort of desire for change or a movement, whatever you want to call it, that grows strong enough, that I think, even in a very corrupted system like we have in California, there is a tendency to find the sort of institutional channels to translate that into change in the real world.
Okay, thank you. And for folks listening who blissfully know less about the California Environmental Quality Act than we do, CEQA was passed in 1970, signed into law by then Governor Ronald Reagan. Most people who studied CEQA, I would say both on the left and the right, have concluded that it has been really weaponized to prevent the and I wrote 2 op-eds, one about Rancho Cucamonga taking 40 years to complete an annexation of land for new housing. It started in the mid-1970s. It was just completed. Still no houses are built, so probably be about 50 years to get those new houses built in Rancho Cucamonga. And the Newhall development near Los Angeles was a planned 60,000 person community. Plans were submitted in 1994. All CEQA-based lawsuits were not resolved until 2017, 5 years after the project had been approved, but then there were more environmental lawsuits. That just seems to be a low-hanging fruit for legislative attention. I'd like to get to some questions here. To the question, is homelessness a growth industry in California? The $17 billion spent over the past 4 years went somewhere. So there are people, companies making big dollars on this. Why is nobody in the California government auditing how this is spent? Or why is not the case? Let me, Michael, let me begin with you, and then we'll go over to Kevin and get his perspective from being within the assembly. So, $17 billion over 4 years. That's a lot of money. Why aren't we looking at where that goes? As a taxpayer, all of us are taxpayers. Yeah, relevant question. Is this just a symptom of the problem that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad it came up again, because I think I realized there was something I forgot to say, which I do think is a huge problem. And I see it's in the other comments, but basically, housing first is a grift in the sense that it is about creating really expensive houses, from $600,000 to $1 million per unit for an apartment for a homeless person. That amount of money allows for a huge number of people to make money as consultants, soft costs, and then for them to all kick back money to the politicians, mayors, but really city council people, governor, legislators, everybody who supports housing first then is rewarded financially from all the people that make money making housing, as opposed to if you're just providing shelter. If you're just Reverend Andy Bales at Union Rescue Mission in Los Angeles, the biggest homeless shelter in Los Angeles, he doesn't make big political contributions. He's providing low-cost shelter. I mean, cheap, basic, low-cost shelter should cost I mean, I don't know, somewhere between $15,000 and $25,000 a year per person, and it should be temporary as you get that person into group home or rehab or reaffiliate them with family and friends. So definitely there is this financial driver behind Housing First. I just think that doesn't quite explain the hold that the discourse has on the brains of voters. That comes from a deeper place. But definitely Housing First is a huge mechanism for recycling housing, money for housing development into political campaigns.
Kevin, can we follow the money? There seems to be not much interest in the legislature for figuring out where that $17 billion went.
No, of course not. I mean, this is precisely what I proposed, was a full audit of all statewide homelessness spending. That's what I proposed again this year. As I said, we were one vote away from getting it done a couple of years ago. But it was really the governor's office that stopped that from happening. And by the way, there was then a bipartisan measure, a Democrat authored a bill that would have sort of done what I was proposing in a more modest way. So I co-authored that. It passed the legislature unanimously. The governor vetoed it. And so we're still really in the dark about a lot of these things. I will say that, it sort of connects to a broader point, which is just the unbelievable growth of the California state budget with diminishing returns, or really negative returns, because things keep getting worse. Like 20 years ago, the budget was $100 billion. This year, it's $300 billion. So you think about that, it's like what, 150 years to get the first 100 billion, 20 years to add 200 billion more, when the quality of government service and the quality of life sort of has declined during those 20 years by every objective metric. And so homelessness is a very clear example of that. We spend more and more, the problem gets worse and worse. That's why I think that, yes, a starting point is, let's look exactly where the money is going and what we're getting in return for it.
No, what we're getting in return for it doesn't seem to be, we're doing a very good job in terms of, quantifying what is out there. And, there's a recent Hoover report written by my colleague Josh Rao, who unfortunately is traveling today. He was going to be part of our event. And Jillian Ludwig, who wrote, "The lack of data on funding recipients, the interaction of homeless with the government, the tracking of outcomes of state funding, the lack of data undermines any reasonable assessment and accountability." One part of what I really like about ACTS is of your legislative proposal is trying to implement in the most technologically advanced state in the country, try to get better measurement. Is that something that there's any interest within the legislature? I know you have a whole package of legislation, but it seems like we can make so much progress if we could just get more data in terms of understanding who they are, what their needs are, and what we need to do. Any possible progress there? And then I'll bring in Michael.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was this bill I mentioned that had bipartisan support. The audit I proposed on the Senate side, there was 5-0 voted in favor of it. There was a smaller audit also of just sort of the continuum of care system that was approved and was conducted. So, the issue has reached a level of salience where there is a kind of, I think, desire on the part of some legislators to at least look like they're doing something about it. But again, I think that a lot of times they're kind of afraid what these audits are going to turn up. They're not going to make people look good when we find out how billions of dollars are just being squandered.
Michael, let me bring you in. There's one question is, and I think this will be right up your alley. The person writes, "I've donated to Life Moves in the Bay Area, which I've been impressed with, providing short-term and up to 1 year shelter for families, plus case management to address gaps in job readiness and health needs, and to help move people to permanent housing." In the event that this is there's a nonprofit you're familiar with, is there something that we can build on there? Is that something that can be scaled up?
I mean, there's a lot there's a lot of good programs out there, and they all follow from using carrots and sticks to help people to overcome addiction and get into recovery and deal with their problematic behaviors. So yeah, the vast majority of the stuff that's funded through public funding is stuff that is not contingency management. Contingency management is where you reward good behavior and you have consequences for self-destructive or destructive behaviors. And the most famous example of this was developed in Birmingham, Alabama, with crack addicts who they'd all get shelter, but then if they pass a drug test, then they would be able to get their own room in permanent supportive housing. And if they fail the drug test, they go back to shelter. There's no requirement like that on the vast majority of publicly funded programs. So yeah, there's plenty of good stuff you can go and find in California, but the preponderance of it that's publicly funded, including Project Room Key, which was all this money during the from stimulus and during the pandemic to just put so-called homeless people into their own motel rooms with no supervision or requirements for behavior. That's just the norm. So it's really about switching the policy away from housing first to shelter first, treatment first, and housing earned.
Thank you. Thank you. Gentlemen, it's been a treat for me to spend the last hour plus with you and learn from you. Just to recap, I learned a lot from you about mental health issues and just how homelessness really has been reclassified or really has been misclassified from the standpoint of who the chronically homeless are and why we continue to fail in that dimension, and the investments that the state needs to make in psychiatric capacity and personnel. And there's a lot of issues that we weren't able to get to, obviously, within 1 hour, but I truly appreciate your time on behalf of the Hoover Institution. Thank you for joining us today. And for those listeners, thank you for being with us. We're glad you were able to join us and learn from two remarkable scholars and very accomplished gentlemen who deeply care about the state and want to make it better. So, gentlemen, thank you so much. Thanks to the Hoover Institution for making all the investments to be able to allow us to join you today. I'm Ohanian on behalf of the Hoover Institution. Thank you, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in the future.